Welcome to Psychopath In Your Life, episode number 2. I'm your host, Dianne Emerson. This podcast is going to be dedicated exclusively to chat about psychopaths. So what I'd like to do is to clear up any questions about, why are you calling them psychopaths? Sometimes I hear sociopaths. Sometimes I hear antisocial personality disorder. Well, here's the deal. There's been a lot of speculation over the terms and controversies, and sometimes on the news, you'll hear somebody described as a psychopathic, narcissistic sociopath. Well, it can't be all three. So what I'd like to do to clarify things is I will upload to my website, and I'll give you details at the close, where to go to find the definitions and how they evolved over the years. A couple of leading experts in the field of psychopathic evaluations, Dr. Carl Gacono and Dr. Alan Avisto, wrote the foreword to my book, and they laid out the different times when the terms were used, psychopath, sociopath, and antisocial personality disorder, and how they changed over time. So for this conversation, we're going to be referring to them as psychopaths. What I found that was really interesting was that even psychopaths themselves disagree about the terms. I interviewed 3 of them for my book, Psychopaths in Our Lives, My Interviews, and 2 of them felt like they preferred the term sociopath. And of course, I asked them why, and what they said was that they felt like the term sociopath had less to do with murder and gruesome activities. And the other one felt like he preferred to be called psychopath because he was very proud of it, and he considered himself to be the lion, and sociopaths were like the hyenas. Well, anyway, you get the picture. So even amongst themselves, they can't quite agree. And I do think amongst the general public, people a lot of times review the words and they think, well, sociopath doesn't sound more like a killer, but really, we won't talk about why and if they're going to kill, because I don't know, your chances are good that they might kill you. But the more socialized they are, probably the less your chance goes down that that's going to happen. And usually you see that happening around control, but we'll get back to that in a little bit here. And in the first podcast, I mentioned the idea of co-mingled diagnosis, and I can give you a perfect example of that. About 3 years or so ago, if you watch the Jodi Arias murder trial, where she brutally murdered her boyfriend, Travis Alexander, they did bring somebody to the stand to give a diagnosis. And it was kind of disappointing because the diagnosis she got was that of a borderline personality disorder. Well, if you could think of why you would think she's not a psychopath, I'd sure like to hear from you. But psychopath was clearly what came to my mind in watching the entire trial. I was at home recovering from triple ankle fracture, so I watched it gavel to gavel, and really, it'd be hard to call her anything but a psychopath. But there may be some reasons that I'm not aware of, like, for example, maybe the prosecution didn't want the jury to have to think about if she's a psychopath. I don't know. I was never involved in the meetings, just kidding, but here again, you see the image we have of psychopaths and people who murder and get caught. And I think it was a head juror when they were trying to decide on the death penalty phase that he just couldn't see a little woman like her doing something so horrific. This is why we need to talk about these things, because they look like us, they talk like us, they walk like us. And unless you're really paying attention to the details of how they operate, you'll be fooled many times over as far as, whether you're dealing with a psychopath or not. They do not want you to know that they're a psychopath. That much I can guarantee. But, I did find it interesting in my book that how many of them are aware that they're psychopaths. For some reason, that never really, I don't know, I guess I didn't think much about it, but it never really occurred to me. But over the years, I heard victims say things like, well, he changed a lot in the last few months, or, I wasn't sure because of these things that when I looked at the checklist, these things weren't on there. And to that, I would have to say, well, he changed in the last few months possibly that might mean that really what you were seeing was his real self. So what he changed from was this self that he wanted to show you to what his real self was. So it wasn't like he changed. In other words, he went from somebody he was playing to be to somebody that he or she became in your eyes. So over the years, a lot gets mistaken on these checklists. For example, I've read a lot of true crime books, and some of them are about socialized psychopaths and some are about non-socialized. And the difference is usually the family bonding that takes place when they're growing up, the time that's put into them, the education level, a lot of times socioeconomic details. And so what will happen is that the less socialized will more than likely end up in the prison system. So how do we figure out who these are that are amongst us? That becomes a real big question here, because we don't know, but we're starting to find out some information. And I can tell you that over the years of hearing from victims, I developed the first online support forum for victims of psychopaths about 18 years ago. But the reason I'm podcasting is because the last 3 years, because of smartphones and times are changing. People moved on and people aren't telling long stories, but I still feel there is a need to talk about this subject because one of the people I interviewed said something that really kind of stuck with me. Because I really had thought, after 18 years of having a forum and writing my book, I'm 65 years old, that I'd pretty much be done with this topic and go on autopilot. But really, it kind of was, one thing that he said, which I kept coming back to was, and this is the word of a psychopath. This isn't me talking about us and them. What he said was, the world is becoming more like us than you. And yeah, I really kind of, that really stuck with me because they don't know how many are out there. Nobody's ever studied it. And like I said in the first podcast, we don't know. How large of a population is it? They're starting to find out that certain industries attract probably a higher level of psychopaths than other industries, but there's a big unknown. And also, to be fair, in the first podcast, I spoke about who is a victim. And I'd like to kind of touch on that today because victims are people, from my experience, and also from the experience of the reporting that the psychopaths I interviewed talked about, victims are typically kind and caring people. And you're going to say, what? What does kind and caring have to do with attracting psychopaths? Well, you're the type, or that is the type that they're looking for. They went into great detail as far as a checklist, as far as what kind of people they're looking to attract. Why kind and caring? Well, because the whole end game is to gain control. So with a kind and caring person, along the way while they're gaining control, the kinder you are, probably the more, the higher your ability to overlook red flags. And I call that living life by painting red flags white. So for example, along the way, they'll be testing the victim with just subtle things. And what they'll do is they have a whole list of things, which the callousness of how they have planned all these things was really very surprising to me. I'd heard from victims all these years, different stories, but I never really had a match up with how much detail went into the planning. And victims would say things over the years, like, for example, well, he told me that he was really dark and evil. And to that, I'd usually ask, well, what did you do? And they'd say, well, I just laughed it off. He had to have been kidding. Well, I don't think he was kidding because that came up in my interviews with these psychopaths. And another thing that they use kind and caring people for is around the pet issue. And you think, what about pets? Well, if you read a serial killer book, a lot of them, when the person is a serial killer, they are likely to have some sort of animal abuse in their background. But here's where it gets turned around. A more socialized psychopath actually plays against what these lists come up with. So, for example, if they know that kind and caring people typically like pets, they will use pets to their advantage. And you say, well, because one gal said, I thought for a long time he was a psychopath, but he loved his dog. So I was confused by that. I said, well, he may be giving you the impression that he loved his dog, but psychopaths don't love anybody but themselves. So it's not even a possibility. And where do we get that from? Well, some of the early checklists were based on the prison population, so clearly animal abuse was an issue. For example, there was a story, and I know you're probably not somewhere where you can write these things down, so you can Google the Fake Rockefeller. And years ago, there was this guy, and he committed a couple murders, but he didn't get caught for those until quite a long time later. But he moved through life and assumed several aliases, and one of them was that he was a member of the Rockefeller family. So you think, whoa, how can you make such a bold claim? Well, sometimes bold claims work out better than small claims when you've got an expanded ego and you're a psychopath. So part of how he blended in was that this one man who wrote a book about him, I think his name is Walter Kern. Walter met him by, he was volunteering at an animal shelter in Montana somewhere, and out of the blue they get contacted by this Rockefeller guy who wanted to adopt a dog they had in the pound. And it was a specific dog, and the dog had a specific handicap and was on a doggy wheelchair. So you'd start to wonder, why a handicapped dog? Why not get one from, your local shelter? Well, because this dog had a story. And the story was that it was a handicapped dog. It had a doggy wheelchair. So when this guy would go cruising through Central Park and whatnot, he would meet a lot of victims because the assumption is, here we go with the assumption versus the reality is, this guy has a handicapped dog. And oh wow, the added plus, he's a Rockefeller. Must be quite a guy. So see how these things can kind of become very misleading. And that's why when they're targeting kind and caring people, they know what kind of triggers that kind and caring people are going to exhibit. I don't know about you, but I've never met many kind and caring people who abused their pets or were, mean and didn't like them. So they develop these personas and they learn to mimic behavior by being the persona that they think will blend into society. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed our chat today. I look forward to hearing from you. I do read all my emails. I've given you, I really, really, really respect your privacy. So you can email me a few different ways. One is through my email, which is Dianne, Dianne, at Dianne Emerson, DianneEmerson.com. Or you can go to my website, which is the same name as this podcast, which is psychopathinyourlife.com. And there you'll find a box where you can, without an email address, you can just send me your questions or your comments. Keep in mind that I won't answer any of your questions or comments via email unless you specifically say, please answer me. I just have a quick question, because I respect your privacy. I'm probably one of the few people on the internet these days that's not trying to develop some big mailing list. So I have no interest in gathering your names. I respect the fact that you want to talk anonymously. And I will do my best to answer your questions and comments on the air. Unfortunately, I can't answer them all via email, but please know that I do read them and I will answer as many as I can. And until then, be safe out there, and we'll look forward to talking to you very soon. Goodbye.